Everybody can hear me okay? All right. Well, thanks for coming tonight. And kind of the purpose of a session tonight is to share with you some of the mistakes I made and what I learned, and hopefully save you some anguish, some weed pulling maybe, and also maybe cut a year or two off of your plans for a native plant garden. And so, I'll share my screen. And I have to first say that I'm not a great photographer. And so I don't have, I thought many times as I was doing this that I should be taking pictures as I go. And so I could, for a presentation like this, but I never did. So I've got a few pictures though. I don't think the ones I'm missing will detract too much. 7 lessons that I kind of distilled out of all the things I thought about over the last 14 years. And I hope some of you had a chance to read the blog article that Keith Crook sent out. And that was written uh, over 10 years ago now. And I can tell you a little bit about what's progressed since then and how well those lessons have held up. So I'll start to tell you a little bit uh, about what I did. And so in 2009, my wife and I bought our little 1.3 acres of paradise in Leavenworth, and it had 2 barns on it. Here's this barn that you're looking at is still there. In front of it is about 150 feet of old pasture. And this picture was taken in the summer, and you can look and see there's English plantain and bulbous bluegrass will become my 2 nemesises over the next 10 or more years. And you can see it was kind of dry, and there was an old orchard up above this property. And depending on where you have your picture, if you look to the right in this picture, there's a metal-sided barn. It was a pole barn that we removed. And so what we were going to do is build a house up just about where that pole barn was. And so some of the pictures I'll show will be up in that area. And unfortunately, I don't have pictures taken down here, but will certainly tell you about what happened. And so basically when we bought the property, it was in the snow. So it was like 2 feet of snow here. And I had visions that this land would be covered with native plants. And I was just very excited for the spring, it was well before we built the house, to see what would grow. And what grew in this pasture area, or in this, what you see in this picture, was one native plant. It was a bare stem lomatium, bare stem balsamum, or bare stem desert parsley is another name. One plant right in front of the door to this barn, and of course got trampled. But I realized that I had a lot of work to do. And so what my idea is I wanted to create what you'd see minus trees. And what this land would have been ponderosa pines and Douglas fir and an understory. But we'll hear from Al next week about firewise planting, and you certainly don't want to live amongst the trees, which I'm sure many of us dreamed of in our youth before the days of wildfires. So this is kind of what I had in mind. This is our grain field that wasn't in the picture I just showed. 12 years later from when the house was built. And this was kind of what I was trying to do. You could see balsam roots. There's some lomatiums in there, some sedges, bunch grasses, lupins, and in the foreground is a snowberry. And so that's kind of the look I was trying to achieve. And unfortunately, if you look on the very right, there's some small trees, and there was, we call it the thicket, of Douglas fir trees. And then there's a couple of big grand fir trees. I don't know how they got there. And then a lot of shrubs. There's elderberries, cascara, mock orange, and those came with the property and have since grown. So you may ask why did I want to do this? And so always I'd liked to have a natural landscape around me. When we used to live in Seattle, we tried to emulate the kind of a subalpine landscape as best we could. And it just makes me feel good about being around those places. And so that was what we wanted to try. That was the main driving force. But also, I didn't want a landscape that would be taking a lot of water. And I know in looking at your registration notes, a number of you felt the same way, that you wanted a low water landscape. and I didn't want to mow. And so we've got a neighbor a few doors away that, in fact, well, the neighbor you can see in the background there had a nice lawn, and I didn't want to have to mow the lawn. And not that I don't spend a lot of time outside doing other things, but that's one thing I didn't want to do. But the one thing that I really couldn't articulate when we first came up with this idea was the benefits a native landscape has for wildlife. And some of you may have read a book or heard about a book called Nature's Best Hope by Doug Ptolemy. And he's got a couple books out, and that's the one title I can remember right now. Both are good. And he talks about the real benefit of native landscapes is the insects they attract. And so here's a picture we took just this weekend. You can see it's a little dime-sized moth that is on a Dyer's lomatium, that little white flower that you see poking up there. And every year, just as soon as these lomatium flowers pop up, which they come up basically with the leaves, these little orange moths are flying around and they're gathering nectar on these plants. And we don't know, I've been trying to identify this little moth, and we don't know what its larvae feed on. I doubt if it's Skyer's lomatiums, but they need a pollen source, and they provide that. But what Doug Ptolemy talks about is that the caterpillars are really at the base of a food web for a lot of animals, birds especially. And so if you want birds in your yard, having caterpillars is good. And so if you can attract butterflies, moths, that's great. Of course, we all know the benefits of having bees and native bees. And Belle talked about in her presentation the advantages of having things blooming all through the year, so the bees have nectar sources through the year. So that's kind of why I wanted to do this. And so now let's get back to the house. So here's the house that we moved in 2010. And so when we got the house built, you can see around it, it's green, but it was all bulbous bluegrass and English plantains and a few other weeds. So I was fairly motivated to make something happen, and it was kind of a blank slate. And so we came up with a plan, and I wanted to really recreate what you saw in that picture before, with kind of three keystone species: the arrowleaf balsam root, the bare stem lomatium, and lupins. And we'll talk about how that worked out. And so we'll talk about first the lessons. The first lesson, and again, there's 7. So these are ones I hope you'll write these down and think about how you can apply them and what your project is. So the first one is you can't just throw down a bunch of seeds and expect to get a native plant garden. That was kind of what I thought is the first year, actually before the house was built, even that area in front of the barn or below the barn, I actually seeded. I'll be talking about that. But this is now 12 years later that I did get kind of what I wanted. You could see the balsam roots with a keen eye. You can see a lot of the bare stem lomatiums out there too. And then there's other plants too, serviceberry blooming on the left. And so it worked ultimately. But my first try down below the barn was a disaster. And so what I had asked several people, I said, I've got this old pasture with bulbous bluegrass and with, in fact, at the time, maybe I didn't even worry about the English plantain. Is it better just to rip everything out and get rid of it, or to till it into the soil? And a lot's been learned about this kind of gardening since then. And so the advice I got at the time, I don't think you'd get today. But what it was is, well, it's probably better to till everything under, and that'll provide some organic materials for the native plants. So that's what we did. We hired Tom's Tilling out of Wenatchee or Cashmere, I can't remember which, and he came in with a tractor and a giant tiller and tilled everything up. We got lots of rocks too. That's another story. But we tilled everything up, and then I had him come back later and actually drill seeds of a native grass mix. And I also had balsam root, lupin, and lomatium seeds mixed in too. And so then it snowed. I was very excited the next spring to see these plants come up. And sure enough, they were coming up, and I could see the different grasses. At the time, I couldn't identify which grasses were which, but I could tell which ones were natives compared to bulbous bluegrass. And and I could see some lupins coming up. I could see some balsam roots coming up. So and some lomations. So I was kind of excited. What I didn't appreciate though is I was also getting a bunch of weeds, and so I counted 44, identified 44 different species of weeds by the time that first summer was over. And what those weeds did, they crowded out pretty much everything. And so few of the bunch grasses survived. Fortunately, a number of the balsam roots did survive. We'll talk about balsam roots a little later. A number of the lomations survived, but I would have been ahead by taking care of the weeds first, and you basically what I would think losing a year, but not really. I'd really be gaining time because I think it took about 5 years to recover from that area. And I learned something about the next year when I did this area, I learned a few things. And then when I did another area, which I'll tell you about, I had even better success. So before we talk about those areas, I want to talk about this concept of the seed bank, which was what we learned about here. And that takes us to lesson number 2, which is control weeds or they will control you. And so here's a picture. A great way to lose friends is to invite your friends over for a weeding party. And so you'll see here, in fact, this was 2010. I don't think I've seen any of these people since then. You know, that's how, like I say, how to lose friends. And I'm just kidding there because I recognize 3 of them that I have seen them since then, but they haven't been here to pull weeds. So the blue flags, those were lupins that were coming up. So the idea was we were working around the plants that we wanted to keep. And unfortunately, when you do this, you are also pull up some of the native plants that are their roots aren't deep enough. So this group here, there were more people too. There's one area down below the house where we worked for 3 of us, or 9 of us worked for 3 hours. So that's 27 hours on this one little area. And I think when we got done, there were no native plants left. We had a big pile of English plantains, but very few native plants left. And so that's why I say you control weeds or they will control you. I have weeded that area every year since then. And now I can weed the whole thing in about 2 hours by myself. So 2 hours compared to 27 that first time. And we've gradually added in more native plants. And it's acceptable now. It's still not what I really wanted. I brought in some balsam roots. There's a few of the native grasses, but they didn't really take hold there very well. And tall buckwheats are doing real well in there. And we've got some other plants that small ones that I put in there too, and a serviceberry and some yellow currant or golden currant. So yeah, what you don't want to do is be spending all your time on your hands and knees pulling weeds, which I did for the first probably 7 years. And that's why this is such an important lesson. If you write down nothing else from our program today, write this: control weeds or they'll control you. And as Mel talked in her presentation, the time to plant native plants is in the fall or in the spring. And unfortunately, when a lot of the weeds are growing is in the summer. And so you might spend your whole summer pulling weeds, and it's too late to plant native plants again. And so you really lose a year or a season, basically. And so what's really important is before you start is to get rid of as many weeds as you can. And so a couple ways to do this. And so I'll talk about a couple ways. First one is probably the more popular way now, which is what they call solarization. And I've got a picture here of, this is at the pollinator garden at the fish hatchery. And this isn't solarization, this is called oculation with a dark plastic. And the idea here was to kill the grass that was there. It was an old turf. On the right is the pollinator garden. And the idea was on the left, they were going to plant a native grasses in there. So the first step was to get rid of the turf. So in the spring, they put down this black plastic and then rolled it up in the fall. And I think Chelsea's on the call. Thanks, Chelsea, for this photograph. You could see the grass was indeed killed. And unfortunately, what we discovered when we rolled up the plastic was that the sod was so thick from this grass that we couldn't get the seeds through it. So since then, that area has been tilled. And so it'll be solarized this year, which is putting down plastic and then sealing the edges so it doesn't blow up. And what will happen in the summer is the sun will germinate any seeds in there, but they won't survive because they're going to get too hot. And so what you're doing is treating that top half-inch or inch of the seed bank, and they are going to, and then you'll be in the fall, they'll be able to plant directly in there with the grass mix they're talking about. So that's a popular way. Now, what I did was with my area was I used Roundup, and a lot of people don't like that, but reading about the very large scale restorations, remember I'm doing probably in areas I'm planting maybe 3/4 of an acre, and having spent a lot of time on my hands and knees and not wanting to do that every year, Roundup was the most expedient method for me. And so I'll tell you about the one area, or the area we were looking at. In fact, let me back up to that slide for a moment, back to this area here. So if you notice in the background on the left, there's another house. So our neighbors were building that house at the time, and they were putting in their drain field, which is right below the house. And the Upper Valley Excavation was there with the excavator. And I went up to Kim, who was running the excavator, and I said, "Hey, can I buy an hour of your time and rip out the sod that's up here?" And so he did. He came down in about an hour, had it ripped out, and that was a great plus in this area. And definitely, had I done that down below rather than tilling it in, would have saved some time. And then the area by our barn where the snow piles up, in fact, right now, that's the only place now in the yard with snow, is I was trying, there's a lot of manure from the barn there, so it's fairly fertile. And what I ended up doing there is treating the area with Roundup, tilling it, or letting it die, tilling it, letting things grow again, hit it with Roundup again. And I may have done that yet a third time, and actually had very good success there planting sedges, which can handle the more moisture and the snowfall. And then the area I've had the best success with was down closer to the road, which we haven't seen a picture of that, which was area our neighbors had a horse at one time. We had the horse down, horse grazed everything. Then I ran a tiller around and tilled it all up, let things grow, treat it with Roundup. And that one I definitely did 3 times with Roundup, planted with a native seed mix, native grasses, and then came back and hit it with a broadleaf specific fertilizer or herbicide, and have a not very nice thriving native grass pasture there, which is what I had intended in the lower part of the barn. So at this stage, that's a good stopping place to see if you have questions about weeds, because we have time through this to pick up your questions while we're going. Anybody have a question they'd like to, or unmute themselves and ask a question?
Unmute or put it in the chat. It's either will be fine.
Well, I will continue then, and by all means, be thinking about questions. And we have, like I say, we have plenty of time. And if you have questions from other parts of the program too, we can.
Hey, Don, question Lola is asking about using a pre-emergent like Preen instead of Roundup.
Yeah, so what a pre-emergent will do is it may be a little more persistent than Roundup. So in other words, you may have trouble if you seed getting the things to grow. Whereas the good part about Roundup and why it's used so commonly is it only kills things that are growing currently, and it's less persistent. Yeah, good question. I do use a pre-emergent in some places, especially around the barn, to try to knock things down. And there's places, or like a pathway, I'll use it in pathways.
And a couple other questions, any place to identify weeds?
Or a good source for weed identification?
Yeah, good. I'm assuming, books or websites.
Yeah, well, you are in luck because Mark Turner, who did the photography for the wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest and trees and shrubs of the Pacific Northwest, has just come out with a weed book for the Pacific Northwest. So it's by Timber Press, And I haven't seen it myself, but I'm sure it's super high quality. I know Mark was working hard collecting the pictures. I was using an old book. I'm pretty sure it's out of print, done by the author was Turner, who did Sagebrush Country, which some of you may have, which was a very good book also. And it was, I think it was for the whole state, but it had at least 44 of the ones I was dealing with. Yeah, great question.
And clear plastic versus dark plastic?
Yeah, and there's people have done work on that, and I think the consensus is the clear plastic's better. And as I understand it, and I've never done solarization on a large scale. As I understand it, the clear plastic allows things to germinate, whereas the black plastic doesn't allow them to germinate. In fact, that reminds me of something I wanted to say about the seed bank, is there's a great article about organic gardening that said with the seed bank, you want to do the opposite of what you do with your personal bank account. Your personal bank account, you want to put money in, put more money in than you take out. Whereas with the seed bank, you want to maximize withdrawals and minimize deposits. So what that means is you want to maximize the number of weeds you remove and minimize deposits, which would be fresh weed seeds. And the only problem with that is when you have really bad weeds, is the weeds will beat you. They'll be going to seed before you can get them all. So it's a challenge, but I managed to do that with the English plantain. We still get a few, but there's maybe 100 a year now instead of 10,000 a year. So there you'll always have some weeds, but the more you can knock out and keep from reseeding, the less you'll have to be on your hands and knees pulling.
And got several new messages here. Let me get to them. Okay, I think that is it actually.
All right.
We recommend newly cleared orchard area before planting natives.
Say that one more time.
What would you recommend for a newly cleared orchard area before planting natives?
Yeah, so if you wanted to plant in the fall, what I would suggest is to have basically till it, prepare the seed bed now and see what happens. If you get a bunch of weeds, then I would hit it with a herbicide or use solarization. So in the fall, it would probably be ready. And it doesn't hurt to do it multiple times or multiple years. But I know if you're like me, you're ready, you want to see some stuff growing. So but a single treatment is certainly better than doing nothing at all. Yeah. Well, let's continue, and certainly have more time for questions. So we'll go to the next lesson that I learned, which is to risk overwatering the first 2 years. And so these are the tools of the trade for me, which is a 5-gallon pail and a watering can. And recall that because I had all these weeds, I really didn't feel like I could sprinkler it because I would just encourage the weeds. So I use a hose where I can reach, but the mistake I made the first year was thinking that these were native plants, that you really didn't have to water them very much. And so I certainly lost a lot that way. So if you think about native plants, they're adapted to this climate, but they have really deep roots. So if you start with a plant that is, say, from a pot and the root is maybe 5 inches long, the ground's probably going to dry out before it gets deep enough. Full grown, it might have roots that are going 4 or 5 feet deep. So you have to help them the first few years till they get established. And so what I do is, you notice those little blue flags I used for lupins in those early days. I still use those little flags and mark the new plants so I know what to water. And it kind of also helps you, in the summer, when you're out watering and you'd be out early. It's a nice way to get outside and kind of check on how things are doing. And the frequency depends on the temperature. So if we get these 100-degree days, I might be watering every other day or new plants. And if we have some balmy weather with some rain, maybe it's just once a week. So kind of judging, I know Mel mentioned checking soil moisture, and so that's a great way to check. In drier areas, you may want to try watering tubes, which is like a 1-inch PVC pipe that's down in the ground. So base of it's at the root zone. You pour the water down the pipe. I've never tried that where I live here in Leavenworth, but in Wenatchee area, that might be a good way to go. So yeah, you definitely, I don't think I've ever killed a plant by overwatering. And of course, here our soil drains really well. If your soil doesn't drain, you might be able to kill a plant by overwatering. But you really want to help them out. And I go 2 years, and then if the plant still looks like it's struggling a little bit, the third year, I'll water it some too. So and then feel free in the chat, if you have questions, then Kirk, you can interrupt me between the slides here. So lesson 4 is you want to expect mortality. Not all your plants are going to make it. I don't think it's just me. I've heard this from other people too. I'd say my success rate when I water things well and do all that, probably 70%, which means 3 out of every 10 plants are probably not going to make it. This picture wasn't about plant mortality, but my wife and our friend Eric, they're looking at this. You can see a bare spot there. It looks like they're saying, yeah, these plants didn't make it. But you got to expect it. So several ways you can compensate for that. One would be to overplant, was certainly a possibility. The other way is to wait a year and replant things that didn't grow, which is pretty much what I do. And another thing to consider too is, have you got the right plant for your particular site? This area, by the way, that you're looking at, this was the front of the house. And I want you to notice that gravel path that they're standing on. I've got a slide of what this area looks like today. But this area actually is, because it's in the front, I weeded a lot. It actually comes out looking pretty good. So, and I noticed, in your registration information too, a number of you said you had areas, like under a quarter acre. And so another thought would be starting small. An area like this size would have been a nice, although I would have had all these other areas. But you can work on one area while you're solarizing or doing something to the next. So that related to that is choosing the right plants for your habitat. And I thought Mel did a really nice job of that in the first session, looking at plants for the Upper Valley where I live, or down near Wenatchee where it's a little bit drier. And so choosing the right plants is really important. This is mock orange, which thrives here. It seeds itself. It grows places you don't want it to grow. But it has beautiful flowers, really nice fragrance, attracts butterflies. So it's a great plant. And what I wanted to share with you is some lessons I learned about the wrong plant. So as a hedge for global warming, I thought, well, I should plant some rabbit brush, if things are going to get really dry and hot. And I could not for the life of me get rabbit brush to grow in Leavenworth. I think the growing season was too short. I wanted those late season yellow flowers. I did get some buds one year, and then the plant died. So I think we got too much snow, it's too cold, too short a growing season. So I had to give up on that. And my wife was very interested in having twinberry, which, if you know twinberry, that's a nice plant. Likes a little moister habitat, and deer love it. So my twinberries didn't make it because of deer, and maybe it was too dry. Probably mostly the deer. So we still would like to try for some twinberry someday, but it would require supplemental water. So I wanted to share some slides here, just so some of the plants that I like and will grow in Upper Valley and down around Wenatchee. So first we talked about arrowleaf balsam root. This is like the flagship plant of our area. Mel sells plugs at Derby Canyon Natives. You can also grow it from seeds that you collect yourself or buy. And I encourage everybody to grow balsam roots because they're such a great plant. It attracts goldfinches and siskins in the summer, and other small mammals. They like the seeds too. And it's just so beautiful. And the thing that you need to know, and I don't want this to discourage you, is it takes 5 years from seed to flower for a balsam root. And people will say, oh my gosh, I don't want to spend that much time. But believe me, 5 years goes by really fast. And it also, if you don't plant some this year, that's yet another year before you get your 5 years of flowers. And with that said, I've had plants that have bloomed not bloom till 7 years. So my advice on balsam roots is get started, maybe plant a few, start with some plugs or get some seeds. The first year, by the way, an arrowleaf balsam root is like one leaf, so don't be alarmed. The other plant I really like that reseeds itself really nicely is the bare stem desert parsley, or a number of different names, biscuit root, pestle parsnip. You may have seen I use interchangeably bare stem lomatium. Lomatium's the genus name. Grows easily from seeds, and it takes about 2 years from seed to flower. And each year it gets a more robust plant. And it was a popular or a very important food for the native peoples. There's lots of different lomatiums, by the way, and many different species were used. And the roots were turned into a flower. And in the spring, these come up very early. And you can imagine if you went the whole winter subsisting on dried food, uh, a, a parsley, this is in the parsley family, or celery, being the, which is, I guess they're the parsley celery family, would taste really good. So they would eat these, the, uh, the leaves and the new shoots, and they would eat the roots. And the other one is lupins. We've got 3 different species here, a different one in the Wenatchee area, up here, two different species. Lupins can grow really well from seed. They don't transplant particularly well. And this one is called the big leaf lupin, or Wyatt's lupin would be another name for it. And we also have here the silky lupin, which grows in little drier habitats. Lupins can be challenging. This area here, or no, I tell you, this is a photo. This is a photo of them in the wild. So I guess I don't have an area that does this well. But lupins, some areas they just won't grow. So that's why it's important to choose plants that are suited for the habitat. And you discover it doesn't grow, don't knock yourself out trying to make it grow. Realize that it might not be suited there for whatever reason. And so we've got some areas lupins grow really well, other areas they don't. And then finally, Mel mentioned buckwheats. I think she's got 6 different species for sale at Derby Canyon Natives, and we're very fortunate to have a nursery like that in our area, by the way. And so this is in the field. The great thing about many of the buckwheats is they bloom midsummer, and so they are provide that nectar source for bees and other pollinators. And it's fun to look at these plants after a or in the summer when they're in full bloom, to look at all the different animals that are using that nectar source. And this is, by the way, that's a nice look. I said, boy, I wish my pasture looked like that. And I do have lots of buckwheats, especially the sulfur buckwheat, tall buckwheat, and snow buckwheat. It's not quite that thick with buckwheat, so this inspires me to plant some more out there. So with that, did any more questions come in, speaking of plants? And then we've got a couple more lessons we could do after that.
Yeah, I have a question about soaker hoses on a timer for daily watering. Is that enough in the summer? And if so, how long should it run and for deep watering?
Yeah, I know nothing about irrigation systems, I'm sorry, but I think what you would want to do if you could monitor soil moisture, and that would be your guide. And unless somebody else has thoughts on how a drip irrigation system would do. But if you've gotten rid of the weeds, that'd be a great way to go, because it saves you a lot of time that you spend watering the plants.
And chocolate tips, lomatium seeds or transplants? What?
Yeah, so that's one. We've got a couple in our yard. They split that into 2 species. So that's fun. We have one of each. So yeah, so I collected seeds from chocolate tips, and or what I thought was chocolate tips. I got one yellow one and one brown one, which was kind of fun. And they are the different species, and they have reseeded themselves. So I've got probably about 6 of them now. They take a long time to get established, but definitely a plant if you like fiddling around with growing seeds. Great plant to pick some up this summer on a hike and get them in the ground. Yeah. I should say about lomatiums, you saw that the moth on the Geyer's lomatium, that's one you can collect seeds for. And I've done that here, and they're seeding themselves now, and it's kind of fun. They're the first flowers out. And there's also a it doesn't have a great common name. So Lomatium ambiguum, or ambiguous desert parsley, is another one that just started a couple years ago and just saw the first bloom today. So that was fun. Yeah. So yeah, Lomatiums are fun to grow and relatively easy to grow.
Any other, there's another question came in. What are your recommendations for lower valley grasses?
Yeah, for lower valley grasses, I would defer to Mel, and in fact I didn't mention this earlier, that that you want to look around and see what grows in your area. And so we're here in Leavenworth, the blue bunch wheatgrass is like the grass, and I would guess that would be a star in the Wenatchee area. Idaho fescue, probably not. It needs a little cooler area. June grass would probably do okay there. Sandberg's bluegrass will do well in the Wenatchee area. And there's a couple other grasses that from the BFI seed mixes from Moses Lake that would be good. But there are seed mixes for different areas, and that would be great to find one that works well where you live. Yeah.
Betsy, do you have any thoughts on those grasses?
Um, I think Indian ricegrass is another strong candidate, and definitely the blue bunch wheatgrass. And if you have a little extra water, oh gosh, my brain just shut off. The big tall one.
Oh,
Uh,
why?
yeah, that actually does really great around here in certain places. But the probably the toughie, again, Indian ricegrass and the June grass that you mentioned, those are great.
Okay, great. Yeah, they that wild rye grows really big. So if you have
Hmm.
space, that's a fun one to plant.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun to include in a landscape.
Yeah. All right, well, let me continue here. We've got we're to lesson 6 of 7, so we'll still have plenty of time for questions when we finish. So this is lesson 6 is replace weeds with something you want, otherwise you will get more weeds. And so with that, it seems obvious, and it's probably of these, it's the hardest one to implement. And here's why: it's because often you're pulling weeds in the summer, and if you plant something new, it's not going to survive. So you need to do something to cover that area up, or else just redig it up later, which is fine too, as long as the weeds don't go to seed. But the other thing is consider hardscaping. And so this is, if you remember that slide about dealing with mortality or expecting mortality, this is that area. And you look now, just this last year, I actually paved with stones that path. And because every year I had weeds coming up on that little gravel path. So hardscaping is always a great thing. And you'll notice here a lot of bare stem lomatiums growing there. And then there's some a balsam root front and center with snow buckwheat against the wall. So yeah, this area has been very successful. Like I said, I weed it thoroughly every year. Looking out there just last week, there's a lot of bulbous bluegrass I need to pull out. But one thing, and we talked about planting seeds, is so I don't know how many years ago I planted seeds of Mariposa lilies out there. And to my surprise, about 5 years later, I had Mariposa lilies, and they do come up every year, and it's very rewarding to see that. I planted yellow bell seeds, and I still haven't seen any yellow bells yet. I don't know if they're going to come there. There's one larkspur that comes up every year, Clarkia, which is I think, Betsy, that's one of the annuals you had, and it comes up every year. It's kind of fun. So yeah, so it's fun that once you get your main area established, then you can plant things like things that are plants that you really like. So yeah, so one thing I wanted to share that's been this tip's worth the price of admission right here is to, if you can get your hands on arborist chips, that is a great mulch. And so in midsummer, if you've got an area that you want to plant something next year, if you could, what I'll do sometimes is take like a corrugated cardboard disc or square, put it down, put a bunch of chips on it, and then put a rock on top of that. And that is a great way to kind of keep more weeds from forming in an area. But I do mulch around new plants with these chips. And as I understand it, the reason these how to get, I guess first, how to get arborist chips is the PUD, at least where we live, they come by and trim trees around power lines every year. And it used to be that you'd get your name on a list at the PUD, and they would, when they had chips that they needed to get rid of, if they're in your area, they drop them off. And the past few years, it's a different company, and they have a little sign on there that says, if you need chips, let us know. And one day I saw they were at the gas station up the road, and it looked like they had a bunch of chips, and I stopped in and said, hey, I could use some chips, and gave them my address. And before the day was out, this pile of chips was on my yard. So this is the pile I have now. This was I got them a different way. But every year I go through a big pile. But again, I'm dealing with a larger area, and it goes on paths. It goes anywhere you don't want weeds. These chips are a great way to go. Yeah, Betsy, you were going to add something about?
Just wanted to say that, yeah, they're great for preventing weeds, but do not put them around desirable plants unless you've composted them for 6 months to a year, because they'll suck the nitrogen out of the soil,
Oh,
your very
interesting.
precious nitrogen. So yeah, they're great for areas where you don't want plants to grow when they're uncomposted.
Yeah, and ultimately they do break down, which is great. And most of the areas I'm redoing it every year. And so if you don't want this big a pile, you can go in with your neighbors. And there may even be places now that have these available in smaller quantities. So let's get to the last lesson then. And then what I say, we have ample time for questions. And that is to enjoy a natural looking yard. And I don't know if any of you have suburban baggage like I do, where you always wanted your yard to be perfectly manicured. And like I was the kid that, if my parents were having people over, I'd be out edging the lawn and trimming the ivy and all that sort of stuff. So it was tough at first to get used to the idea that you're going to have stems from the previous year's plants out there. It's going to be brown part of the year. But what you were trying to really to create is a habitat for the plants and animals that are there. And with those stems, there's going to be bees, there's going to be insects that are going to spend the winter in those stems. In fact, one of the things they say is uh, the you don't want to remove those old stems until around what we were looking at today, around tax time, so mid-April, say, and longer if you can go that way. So there's lots of but once it's that way, you're used to it. It's really fun, and you can see some of the little animals. We in our yard, we had I think Kirk had asked me when we were first starting if we get many animals, and so I kind of jotted down what we have, and we're again on this, we're near the forest, so we have the advantage over home in the city. But we have 4 kinds of snakes, 1 lizard, frogs, salamanders, 9 small mammals. Thanks to the cat, we know about those. Lots of butterflies and moths, and then lots of birds that come through, plus a number of birds, probably about 6 different bird species that actually nest in the yard. Some nest in the shrubs, some on the ground. We have a birdhouse for the swallows, and they're in the trees too. We have western tanagers that nest in the yard. So it's fun to keep an eye on how the wildlife are doing. So with that, we've got about almost 15 minutes left, and I'd be glad to take any questions or comments you have. I've got my email address here, and I want to encourage you after this, if you've got questions, feel free to send me an email. If anybody ever wants to come by, we're up on Icicle Road, about where Prowl Street is. Send me an email. I'd be glad to show you around. If you bring a weeding tool, we'll be glad to have you help me. And if you're interested in sedges, I've got lots of sedges I grow, and it's a long story, not part of this one, but if you'd like to try sedges in your yard, we've got upland sedges that I'd be glad to send you home with some. This picture, by the way, is in an area we do water a little bit. There's below to the right of the cat is what we call the bird bath. It's really more the cat's drinking fountain. But you'll see there the balsam root, lupin, a Brandiges lomatium here. Directly below the cat's a taper leaf penstemon. And to the left of that is a Brown's peony. So it's fun to get, and there's sedges in there to the right of the balsam root. And there's spirea, bitter cherry, Oregon grape, and probably a couple of things that I can't see from here. So this is early spring. This would be another month. It'll probably look like this. So yeah, how about any questions that you have?
Yep. Betsy has her hand up, or is that from earlier? Okay, guess that was early. So this is from, well, I can't see the name. Am I dreaming, or is it possible to get to the point of just letting everything do its thing and not have to clean up last year's dead stuff?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So so you could just never do any cleanup, and that'd be great. Yeah. And there's going to be some cleanup you have to do. If you have trees, branches are going to fall in the yard. You want to get rid of those so you don't have a fire hazard. But yeah, you could just let it go. And I generally do a little bit of cleanup in through the summer, just because I'm out there checking on weeds, and I'll have a bucket with me, and I'll pull some stuff out. But yeah, it's all that's returning organic material to the soil, home for insects and shrews, things like that are living under the leaf litter. Yeah.
Other questions? And since Al's not here, I'll throw in keeping that dead material in mind in terms of fire-wise, and not having fire fuels building up around your house.
Right. Yeah, when speaking of that, so against the house, we started with some plants. We gradually have replaced the chip mulch with rocks, and gradually improving our firewise areas through the year. So Al's presentation would be a great one for everyone to see. Yeah, so be glad to answer any more questions. All right, well, again, feel free to let me know if you want to come by sometime. Enjoy showing people around, talking about what works and what doesn't work, and seeing it firsthand is always a great thing. So don't be shy.
Thank you very much, Don, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and hope to see you next week.